leaving the home. Sorry, I'm back. Leaving the home and doing something separate from what her mother did or what her sister has done. So I think that it would be remiss to not really look at, while they are these minor characters, they do represent so much more to Connie. We also have Ellie Oscar, who I'm not really sure what to make of him. Other than that, we know that he's Arnold's sidekick friend who comes along for the ride. And we get the sense that they take turns in this, picking up chicks kind of thing. Like, is he a wingman? I don't know. But we know that he's older. He's described as being this like 40-year-old with a baby face, which is weird. But what is interesting about him is while Arnold is this smooth talking, presenting very much a threat to Connie in a non-threatening way, Ellie is that overt sense of violence. He threatens to tear the phone lines up, to knock in the door. So is he the violence behind the facade of Arnold friend that's submissive somewhere that's subtly there and under the surface? I don't know. I think that he's an interesting character to look at, both in terms of how his pairing with Arnold. I also think it's interesting that he's got this kind of effeminate name. I don't know what that means, but I'd be interested to see what you guys think. And also, his name is similar to Eddie, the guy from the dine-in that she hangs out with. Again, I don't know quite what to make with this. I'm still thinking about it. But I think it would be remiss not to at least address him in some way. The conflict we have: person versus person, Arnold versus Connie, person versus society. Looking at it, Connie and her, what are the society's expectations of her? Connie within herself, and her interactions with her the family unit. There are so many like different elements and layers of these various conflicts, but I think one of the main conflict to really think about is the difference between Connie's view of the world and the way the world really is, which is, I think, what ultimately gets her in trouble. Some symbolism. One of the symbols that I want to talk about. She activated Siri. One of the things that I want to talk about is this gold jalopy. And as I said earlier in the close reading, a jalopy is a POS car. And there's so much duality in this one symbol, because on one hand, it's gold, which means that it's of value, that it's impressive, whatever you think of when you think of gold. But on the other hand, it's a piece of crap. It's got all these dents in it, and it's kind of like one of if something looks too good to be true, it probably is, like that fool's gold thing that I already mentioned. In some ways, it is this representation of freedom that's associated with teenage youth. This idea of escape. I'm going to escape where I've been, and I'm going to go somewhere else. But ironically, what Connie would see as freedom and as an escape from her home, this car is ultimately going to drive her to her death. So again, there's that duality there that I think is so interesting. It's also a tangible representation of Arnold's past. It's got all of these things that should indicate he's not really a good guy, that Connie is blinded to because all she sees is the gold car that is going to take her somewhere. It's also a representation of Connie's future, where she's going. And it's also an aspect of Arnold's disguise in that it makes him look like he's a teenage guy with this POS car that just wants to take a chick on a ride. And it's something that allures Connie to him, and it's something that he can use to as a means of getting in, like that in to talk to her. On the car, there's the code, and I know that as you guys are reading, you're like, what does that mean? What does the code mean? Well, some people have said that the code is biblical, and it's where we can get the words from the title. If you look at Judges, chapter 19, verse 17, you do get the title, where are you going and where do you come from? And the 33 would be Judges. It's the 33rd book in the Bible backwards. So if you start at Revelation and move the last book of the Bible and you move forward, you have Judges book 30, book 33. Well, why backwards? Well, why would the devil use the Bible appropriately? But I also think it's interesting in that when Christ is tempted and there's 40 days in the desert, he uses the words from the Bible to tempt Jesus, which if you look at, I mentioned Connie as a Christ-like figure earlier, and I will again in a minute, but if he is this representation of the devil, what better way to tempt somebody than with the word of God? So the other meaning of the text that we have is they represent Arnold's intentions towards Connie. And if you add those numbers together, you'll get the reference to what I mean. So the code is very interesting, and I like both interpretations of it, because I think that, on one hand, we've got the biblical, which is kind of a representation of what we hold as value, what we hold as good. But then on the other hand, there's that perversion. Again, that two-sidedness. There's also Connie's house as a symbol, which I think is interesting. On one hand, the house is this element of safety. It's the representation of the family unit. But again, like everything in this story, it's got two sides. Because while it is a representation of the family unit, Connie's family is pretty dysfunctional. And in some cases, people have argued that Joyce Carol Oates is making a commentary on the breakdown of the family unit and what happens when that happens. It's also a barrier between Connie's two selves. It's something that keeps her in childhood, but the desire to leave is her adulthood. And if you look at some of the descriptive words that Joyce Carol Oates uses to describe the house, there's the asbestos ranch house, which, what do you think of? You've seen those commercials about asbestos. They're dangerous. They're killing. They're a silent killer. So in some ways, this is showing that this is not a safe place, and it ultimately is not. It's one that Arnold's friend is able to penetrate. And she also calls the house a cardboard house. That's what Arnold calls it. All he has to do is tear down her daddy's cardboard house, because it's not he's able to break through that kind of barrier. And I think that is also worth noting that if one of the traditional meanings of a house symbolically is that it is a representation of the female body. Women are associated with those private home domesticated spheres, and Connie as a woman, Arnold says that I'm going to break through the barrier that is your house. So it is kind of interesting to look at the house as a representation of Connie's body when you think about what happens later in the text. Some other symbolism: Connie as a Christ-like figure. Is her innocence something that is sacrificed? Is she giving up her, when she leaves the house, to what she assumes would be to save her family? Is she a lamb to slaughter, so to speak? Do we sacrifice our innocence in order, through life, do our experiences, do we forsake our innocence through our knowledge of the way that the world works? I think it's Connie as this Christ-like figure who is tempted by the devil is something that's interesting. There's also that idea of Arnold's face. It's a mask. He's got two of them. It's both familiar and not. It is almost like the faces of those boys that Connie dreams of, in that it's obscured and blurred. But again, there's that concept of what he appears to be versus what he really is. I want to say that music is more of a motif than a symbol, but music is definitely a motif that follows us that Joyce Carol Oates uses consistently throughout the story. And as it's a representation of Connie's inner life, it's a source of pleasure, sexuality, because if you think of music, it's this, it's got rhythm, it's got movement like bodies do. It's a representation of popular culture, in that we get these romantic ideas that can sometimes be deceiving. And it's this corruptive force that favors imagination over intuition. You guys can read that on your own, but some of the themes that are prevalent in this novel is that idea of coming of age, or the German word Bildungsroman, which is basically when we have this rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. We've experienced something that has caused us to gain knowledge in a way that keeps us from being, we're disillusioned with life. There's also this idea of youthful romantic fantasy, and that our dreams blind youth to the harsh dangers of maturity, and that these things that Connie is so preoccupied by, that she doesn't take them seriously, and she should. There's that element of especially in a lot of feminist